Throughout Silent Hill 2, there was one question that I couldn't get off my mind. Why was James sent to this town? For a brief catch-up on how Silent Hill works, people who have done horrible things or are in a horrible place in life are drawn to this town one way or the other, and the way that that person perceives the town changes to force them to confront symbols of their sins or their personal horrors. Eddie, for instance, was bullied his entire life, until one day he snapped and kneecapped one of his tormentors and killed their dog. So, he's drawn to Silent Hill, where he's forced to face his murderous rage, as well as the gluttony that led him to being bullied in the first place. Angela had a downright disgusting home life as a child, full of sexual abuse. It led to her not trusting anybody and wanting to die, so Silent Hill drew her in and forced her to confront those horrors by convincing her she had one more thing to live for, finding her mother. She's caught in a constant battle between wanting to kill herself and clinging on to the hope that her mother might still be alive and can pull her from the edge. So why was James Sunderland drawn to Silent Hill by this letter from his long-deceased wife? Again, this was the question that was haunting me throughout the entire game, causing me to not even trust my protagonist. What did he do that was so bad? Is he like Eddie, where his punishment is debatably deserved? Or is he like Angela, where he's just being forced to confront something he's repressed his entire life? Well, to get to the bottom of this, we'll have to treat the town of Silent Hill as if it were a character with motivations of its own. To figure out the motive behind Silent Hill's crimes against these characters, we'll have to discuss the specifics of them. We've already covered the basics of how Silent Hill acts as each character's own personal hell, but what does it all lead to? Does this town somehow help these people by forcing them to confront their traumas? Is it just out to make them miserable stew in their misery? Well, as I'm sure you can infer, it's all just an illusion. Eddie won't find a place to hide from his crimes in Silent Hill. Angela's mom isn't waiting for her there, and neither is James's wife. All of these characters come to Silent Hill seeking something, and none of them find it. In fact, the town just worsens their condition. So what did James do that was on par with shooting a bully and his dog, or hating the world and wanting to kill yourself? Well, it wasn't the disease that ultimately took James's wife, Mary, from him. He killed her. This isn't revealed until the very end of the game, and so for the rest of its runtime we're just watching James, wondering what's going on in his head. He seems like a pretty normal guy, relatively speaking. He's depressed, he doesn't have a whole lot to live for, and he's maybe a bit antisocial, but he isn't insane like our main supporting characters. Well, this is because he's repressed what he did from his mind and swallowed the guilt, just like how Angela couldn't go through with any of her previous suicide attempts, and just like how Eddie thought he could run away from his crimes. This is how Silent Hill manages to quote-unquote help these people, even if James is the only one to survive. The town acts as a reality check. We don't get to spend as much time with the supporting cast as we do James, but let's look to them as an example. In our first encounter with Eddie, he tells us that he didn't kill the man who's lying next to him. He's throwing up in a toilet, he's lying about a murder. He hasn't accepted this gluttony and horrible bloodlust as an irrevocable part of him. Parallel to this, in our first encounter with Angela, she's in a graveyard, telling us that she's looking for her mother. She doesn't act all that afraid of us, and she isn't, at that moment, attempting suicide. Like Eddie, she's lying to herself. Eddie thinks he can hide from his crimes, and Angela thinks she can hide from her abusive childhood, and the suicidal tendencies it led to. Well, as we progress through the game, our next encounter with Eddie has him stuffing his face with pizza, the coping mechanism that led him to being bullied in the first place and sent him on this dark path. Silent Hill gave him a pizza, and symbolically he started to understand why he is the way he is. He's confronting what sent him on that path. It wasn't the bullies were inevitable. It was his gluttony. Again, in parallel, our second meeting with Angela has her recognizing that her life as a child was cruel and that it scarred her for life. Just look at how terrified she is when James almost touches her, whereas she wasn't too jumpy at all when they first met, and she was still repressing things. James takes the knife from her, her intended suicide weapon, and she's left to think about the awful things that led her to being who she is now. It parallels perfectly with Eddie's second encounter. For Eddie, this gluttonous coping mechanism set him on a dark path, and for Angela, it was her abusive upbringing. Now's as good a time as any to mention that I don't blame these characters for what they became. Eddie can no more be blamed for his gluttony and torment than Angela can be blamed for abusive childhood, but both of these characters, at least initially, feel as if they deserve their torments. Well, the final encounter with these two characters is when they die. Essentially, Silent Hill has finished teaching them their lesson, that no matter how cruel their lives were, they'll never stop feeling remorse over what they did or what they became. We find Eddie in a prison cafeteria, right next to the body of a man that he openly admits to murdering, and then he tries to kill us, ultimately leading to us putting him down. Angela, on the other hand, realizes that her mom, the one thing keeping her from suicide, is, in fact, dead, and she walks up the stairs of a burning building, setting her fate in stone. Like Eddie and his bloodlust, Angela realized that she'll never stop yearning for death. Sure, as their second encounters taught us, it's not the character's fault that they turned out the way that they did, but that doesn't erase the damage. One can acknowledge that they've always had a cruel predisposition towards addiction, but that alone won't make them any less of an alcoholic. So anyways, since I know I'll get comments about this, what about Maria and Laura? Well, it can be debated whether or not those two characters are real, since their role in the story is directly linked to James's torture, whereas Eddie and Angela are simply there to be put through a punishment parallel to James's. So, in other words, Maria and Laura weren't drawn to Silent Hill to confront their dark history, they're only illusions made to further James's punishment. So, does James's experience in Silent Hill mirror that of Angela and Eddie? Absolutely. However, given that we're with him throughout the entire game, we see much more of the process of confrontation, rather than just the snippets of it we saw in Eddie and Angela's scenes. In the beginning, like Angela in the graveyard or Eddie in the apartments, James is doing his best to repress what happened to his wife. Rather than admitting to the murder, he tells himself that Mary was killed by the disease, and he's clinging to the hope that she might still be alive somehow. Now we get to see his experience in Silent Hill in more detail than we see Angela and Eddie's. As we progress through the apartment buildings, we start fighting these leg monsters whose design is, let's say, sexually charged. This is where Silent Hill first starts to really be personalized to fit James. At this point, we still don't know that James killed his wife, so we're forced to wonder what these sexualized monsters represent. Was James fantasizing about other women during his wife's final days? Well, between this wall, whose symbolism need not be explained, and the incredibly phallic pyramid head having his way with the leg monsters, it seems like we're on the right track with this theory. However, James's lust for any woman other than his sickly wife is, while despicable, a perfectly natural human response to his situation. I guarantee that nearly any man in his late 20s would be struck with similar thoughts in James's situation, and they'd probably hate themselves for it just as much as James does. Still, something is missing. That natural, subconscious response shouldn't be enough to damn James to a stay at Silent Hill. Well, Angela's torment that brought her here was also a perfectly natural human response to the horrible things that happened outside of her control. But the reason she was actually drawn to Silent Hill is because she was suppressing that trauma, and suppressing her suicidal urges. So what is James suppressing? Having finished the game, we know that it was the murder, but in the meantime, I was thinking that he must have cheated on her, a la Senator John Edwards, who had an affair with a prostitute while his wife was battling breast cancer. Well, moving forward, James meets Maria, who is essentially a sexually promiscuous version of Mary. In fact, she looks and sounds exactly like her, save for a more risque outfit and a waist tattoo. Maria, of course, represents what James's subconscious wishes Mary had been more like in her final days. Slutty, obsessed with James, and less openly hostile towards him, as anyone on death's door would be from time to time. The fact that James doesn't stop looking for Mary upon meeting Maria can only mean one thing. A slutty, healthy version of Mary wasn't what he was looking for. He had something else that was eating at him. This just confirms what we already suspected. James is indeed suppressing something much darker than extramarital lust. Well, if we push past Silent Hill 2's incredible notoriety as a horror game that gets into our psyche by using sexual imagery, this is all still extremely subtle. So it goes without saying that this isn't where the symbolic exposition into James's subconscious ends. As we move forward, Laura tells us that we didn't really love Mary. We pass through a strip club with Maria, we fight sexy nurse monsters in a hospital, and we descend into the underbelly of Silent Hill, until eventually we get the Great Knife, the weapon wielded by Pyramid Head. At this point, it becomes impossible to ignore that Pyramid Head, while being the game's most notorious antagonist, is in fact a metaphor for James himself. I don't need to tell you what Pyramid Head's great big knife represents. It's difficult to wield, but James uses it to fuck enemies up, double entendre intended. Well, if we look deeper into this knife as a symbol, it becomes clear that James's male urges have the power to kill. Eddie fights James to his death, then not long after we get our grand revelation about James. Eddie wasn't the first person he's killed. James and Mary's special place, the Lakeview Hotel, burns down, Angela kills herself in the fire, and James is left to battle two Pyramid Heads. Eventually, they concede and kill themselves with their spears, and all that's left for James to do is confront the illusional ghost of Mary. He admits to her, or more accurately to himself, that he came to hate her in her final days. Sure, she told him that she wanted to die, but she also said that she didn't want to die. James selfishly chose to only listen to the side of her that wanted death.
I told you that I wanted to die, James. I wanted the pain to end.
That's why I did it, honey. I just couldn't watch you suffer. No. That's not true. You also said you didn't want to die. The truth is, I hated you. I wanted you out of the way. I wanted my life back.
Silent Hill 2 is a perfect example of how karma works in the real world. Not the metaphysical sort of karma, but the kind that is built into our brains. If a normal person with a healthy mind does something bad, they feel guilty. In that sense, the punishment always fits the crime. If you litter a little bit, you might feel bad about it for a day or two, then never think about it again. If you kill someone, it'll eat at you for the rest of your life. That's what happened to James. Sure, in Mary's final days, James came to hate her, but that doesn't mean that he ever stopped loving her, and that doesn't alleviate him of his guilt. James only told himself that he hated her so that he could move on past his killing. When that didn't work, he told himself that he only killed her because she wanted to die, and with that, he could start blaming her death on the disease. All of this is just James repressing the truth of what he did. James was just a young man. He wanted so feverishly to move on from his dying wife that he killed her. However, no amount of repressing can stop the karma in James's brain from striking back at him and making him feel the same pain that he caused.
James, if that were true, then why do you look so sad?
Trying to repress the karma of your mind is only ever a temporary measure. Karma will always win out in the end, and Silent Hill does nothing but speed up that process, and in that sense, Silent Hill is a very real place. It's where our minds take us when we know that we've done something wrong, and when no amount of repression can cover that up. It's where our minds take us when we're regretting our past and thinking that we don't deserve to live. It's where our minds take us when we realize that we aren't a victim but a perpetrator. It's where we go to seek out the punishment that we so desperately hope will help us move on. James killed Mary so that he could move on with his life, but as it turns out, it did nothing but ensure that he would never move on. It brought him to Silent Hill.